Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. I'm very excited to do this episode on the theology of Batman. Now, uh, I'm doing this episode just for fun, and I know that for some of you, you've been anticipating my presentation eventually on intercession of saints in ancient Judaism, and are wondering perhaps when I'll get back to kind of the more traditional Catholic apologetics work. And right now, because I'm at near the end of the semester, things are getting a little busy, but I'm going to try my best to eventually get back to those topics. But right now, I thought, why not do something fun? And so you're going to learn today that I'm a huge fan of Batman. This is probably going to be the nerdiest episode that I've ever done. And you might be surprised, actually, a lot of the relevance and application that being a Batman fan has for doing theology and even Catholic apologetics. So, of course, if you have questions, feel free to include them in the chat, and I'll try to do my best. And also, I know that some of you out there might actually be even bigger Batman fans than I am. Some of you might know, I don't know what exact issue of Detective Comics it was in 1939 that Bill Finger and Bob Kane released to start off the Batman character. I don't know. If I get anything wrong, please feel free to correct me in the live chat. But I thought that this episode today could be just, fun, and you might enjoy actually just learning about the character of Batman and the relevance that this character can have to doing Catholic apologetics and theology. All right. And somebody asked earlier in the chat if I'm going to talk about The Batman, Matt Reeves movie. And I will talk about it a little bit, but I'm mainly focusing on just the character in general. Now, I think I finally figured out how to make the PowerPoint presentation change and have it change on the screen. So let me just go back and check to make sure that, yes, on your screen, it should be, yes, different. Okay, good. So I can do my presentation now. Please let me know in the live chat if there are any issues, and I'll be more than happy to try and accommodate. All right. So I'm going to focus on three theological topics. The first is going to be the idea of a canon. The second is going to be human nature. And I thought it'd be fun to bring our friend Eliakim back because I think there's some relevance between the Eliakim argument and the Batman lore. I'll get into what I mean by that in particular. So these are the three theological topics I'm going to look at. And I'm going to try to first begin with just, okay, what theological concept am I bringing up first? What is its connection to Batman? And then what's the application that making the connection to Batman has to theology? And with the thumbnail on the screen, when I did my interview with Matt Fradd, my long testimony, I talked about how I had a adopted grandfather named Grandpa David. And just to give the quick rundown, I came to the U.S. when I was just a child. My father's a Baptist minister, and so he came to the U.S. to get his seminary education. And in the Baptist church, I had people who were basically like my grandparents because my biological grandparents were back home in India, and I grew up in the U.S. In the Baptist church with people who were like my adopted grandparents. And I had an adopted grandfather in particular named David, who was a very Bible believing man, very devout, very good natured. And he got me interested in Batman when I was a kid. I think the first Batman movie I ever watched was Batman Forever. And I just fell in love with it instantly. And I think about this time in my childhood, Batman Begins came out, the first of the Christopher Nolan trilogy. And I remember I asked my Grandpa David, Grandpa, what's your favorite superhero, or who's your favorite superhero? And I was expecting him to say Batman because that's what he got me, hooked onto basically. But he said, no, actually, my favorite superhero is the Flash. And I feel like that might tell you a little bit about his personality, right? If you like the Flash, he's a very upbeat, very fun guy. Both my grandfather and the Flash. And then, of course, I loved Batman the animated series. I watched that very religiously, you could say, as a kid. And I also loved Batman Beyond. I watched that a lot as a kid. Justice League, just the good old DC animated TV shows. Yeah, I watched all those when I was younger. So, all right, let's get into the presentation. So let's first talk about a canon. So the basic theological idea of a canon is that you have like you have the official books of a particular religious community, and it actually is sufficient that you just have a minimum number of books or a minimum list of books in order for it to count as a canon. Some people think I mean, and usually with the idea of a canon, there's this idea of closure, and so a maximum cap is usually implied, although that's not always the case. And I used to say, actually, and I'm going to repent of this live on the stream, that a canon means that you have no less and no more books. But as I just said now, just having no less than these is sufficient to have a canon. You could have potentially more that aren't officially recognized. But the point is that at least with this minimum, you are settling some theological debates. So the Council of Trent, for example, when it declares what the holy books of scripture are, it just says anathema to anyone who has less than these, aka the reformers. So theoretically speaking, if the Ethiopian Orthodox Church with its canon, let's say, entered into communion with Rome, their canon could just as fine include, Enoch and their other books, rather than, they wouldn't fall under the anathema of Trent. And so the point then is that at least if you have a canonical minimum, that's enough to count as a canon. And of course, there are other ways to think about a canon, like what is the official way of telling a story? There can be a canonical way of telling the story. There can be a canonical interpretation, like this is how we traditionally usually interpret a text or a document. All right, so you'll be surprised then on how like the idea of a canon appears within the Batman fandom. So, for example, within the Batman lore, there is, if you will, a kind of canon of texts. Now, there is a multiverse. You have Earth 1 Batman, you have Earth, I don't know, all these other like multiverses of Batmans out there. You have Scott Snyder's iteration, you have Frank Miller's iteration, you have, Jeff Loeb, Tim Sale's version of Batman. So, you have all these different versions of Batman and all these multiverses out there. But there are still, for Batman fans, like canonical texts. Like this is definitely part of the official lore of the character. And typically when, if you think about Batman, you assume that these events happened, that in one iteration or another, Joker killed the Jason Todd, who is, I think, the third or fourth Robin, if I'm not mistaken. And that Robin becomes eventually Red Hood, spoiler alert. And that's typically taken as just it happened, right? Nobody really questions that that's part of the official Batman lore. That's part of this character. So, for example, the canonical texts are one, Batman Year One, Frank Miller's kind of origin story for the character, which is really actually great. I was amazed actually at how much I liked Year One, because I watched the animated movie first and I was kind of like, it's fine. But the comic's so good. Then you have Batman The Long Halloween, which establishes that the Waynes have a mob connection. And this was picked up then in Matt Reeves' The Batman, with Robert Pattinson. Then you have Batman: A Death in the Family, where Jason Todd dies. Then you have Batman Under the Red Hood, where Jason Todd comes back as Red Hood. And then you have The Killing Joke by Alan Moore, which you see pictured there on the upper right, which is probably like the definitive Batman Joker story. And you get a little bit into the origins of the character, although still it's not entirely established whether or not that's a reliable origin story for the Joker. Because obviously the Joker says, if I could have a past, I prefer it to be multiple choice. So we get an idea maybe of who this character is, but I don't know if it's ever been like officially confirmed. Like this Joker, this is the origin story of Joker. I think it's the one that is generally accepted, but obviously there's room for Joker not being a reliable narrator of his own story. Okay, then there's Batman Hush, which, I mean, that might be controversial, but I think for the most part, like, we accept that there was this character, Thomas Elliot. He was childhood friends with Bruce Wayne, and then he appears in the story. There's The Dark Knight Returns, Frank Miller's other great comic, on the upper left there, which is basically dealing with an older Batman who is retired. So now he's just living his life as Bruce Wayne, but he feels the call to come back as the Batman. And it's just a great comic book, dealing with, I mean, just all kinds of themes relating from, and we're going to talk about this comic actually in the stream about, themes of like redemption, government, authority, guilt, these sorts of things. I mean, it's a great comic. Also, it's, Batman fighting Superman. It's a very famous moment in the comic. I won't spoil anything else. Okay, now There are new texts that are becoming, I think, gradually part of the Batman canon. So I think, basically, I think Scott Snyder's, he had the New 52 Batman, and let's see, revamping the character essentially within a new universe. And he has volumes one and the whole series I think is done from what I remember his run of the New 52 Batman. But volumes one and two deal with the Court of Owls. And from what I can basically tell, this story is now considered canon among Batman fans. So, maybe I should have actually included it in the top list, but I'm just kind of waiting to see if we get more confirmation. Obviously, it's in the Gotham Knights video game. That plot is taken up, and so typically speaking, you can establish the canon for these Batman stories once you have like at least one or two other comics or pieces of media that cite the the original comic. So I think Court of Owls is getting close to basically being canonical, if not already. Then you have Batman Arkham Asylum. What is it? A Madhouse on Mad Earth. Uh, great comic book. Very dark, very gritty. Deals with the origins of Amadeus Arkham, after whom Arkham Asylum is named. And basically, it's Batman showing up one night to try and because Joker's taken over the asylum and Batman's trying to save some hostages and play Joker's game. It's a great comic. Um, I don't know if it really counts as canon, but it's very loved within the Batman community. And then there's Batman Ego, which explores the psychology of Batman on a very deep level, as the title suggests. In particular, this idea that the Batman is actually a separate personality within Bruce Wayne that was a result of childhood trauma. And it's a manifestation of just his anger, his viciousness, his desire to get back at the world. And kind of almost maybe a coping mechanism. I don't know if I would go that far. But The Dark Knight Returns does allude to there being like this double personality in Batman, that the Batman is another character within Bruce Wayne's psyche. Uh, Whereas other iterations just kind of make the Batman and Bruce Wayne seamless characters. Or really, there's not a Batman. It's there's just Bruce Wayne, and then he puts on this persona of Batman, but they're really just the same person. Some comics will do that, but I think uh, I kind of like the idea that there's like this separate entity that's part of Bruce Wayne, but is not quite the normal Bruce Wayne that is the Batman. So certainly the Batman Arkham video games explored this theme, and that happens in Batman Arkham Knight. Well, this is a spoiler too if you haven't seen Batman Arkham Knight or played the game. But like basically, with the fear toxin, Scarecrow basically kills what remains of Bruce Wayne, and then what's only left is then the Batman, right? And so that's why, like, even when Bruce has his mask off, he has, because Kevin Conroy, and just God rest his soul, Kevin Conroy, the voice actor for Batman, probably the most legendary voice actor for Batman, the definitive voice actor. His voice will change when he plays Bruce and when he plays Batman. And in the scene where like Batman's cowl is taken off and he's exposed to Gotham, this is the Arkhamverse canon. This isn't necessarily like the universal canon of Batman. His voice, even though his mask is gone, still remains as the Batman's voice, which gives an indication then that Bruce Wayne is not there anymore after his cowl is gone and Scarecrow has used the fear toxin to take over what was left of Bruce Wayne. So I'm just pointing out that there's other Batman media that explores this idea of there being these two personalities within Batman. And then there's an apocryphal text, which I don't know if you guys have read this yet. It's called The Three Jokers. I really love this comic. It builds upon the classic OG Batman of Bill Finger and Bob Kane. And then it also builds upon The Killing Joke and A Death in the Family, which is where Jason Todd dies. And basically, The Three Jokers says that there have been three different versions of Joker throughout the ages, right? So you have the first Joker, who's kind of this old-time mobster. That's certainly how he's depicted. And you see this taken up by Tim Burton in his Batman movies. Or at least, it's in Batman, not Batman Returns. And then the second iteration of the Joker is, I think, Alan Moore's The Killing Joke Joker. And then the third iteration is the Death in the Family, which is like the most psychotic and crazy version of Joker. And yeah, the Three Jokers basically just explores, you know, these three Jokers, Red Hood coming back, facing, you know, one of the Joker who killed him originally, and just all that. But the thing is, like, the Three Jokers, I don't think is going to actually ever be officially recognized as canon, especially because like the idea of Three Jokers is kind of bizarre. But it's like a fun apocryphal text that explores one possibility within the Batman universe. It expands upon one particular tale, and takes it to to a certain conclusion. Well, so here then, among Batman fans, we've been able to develop like a canon of the primary texts. These are like the established texts, or at least events that go within the life of what we consider to be the canonical Batman. But what's interesting is that there's not a single text here that I would say like contains all of the Batman, right? All of them have bits and pieces, but obviously each author and designer, or excuse me, penciler and colorer, they all have their version of Batman. So it's, Frank Miller's Batman Year One and Dark Knight Returns, they are the same Batman, but you can't just automatically assume then that like the Killing Joke Batman is the same Batman as Frank Miller's, even though they seem to be connected. Right. So in some sense, we're having to harmonize and put all these pieces together while acknowledging at the same time these are different iterations of the same character. And it's actually interesting because it makes you think about then the fact that we have like multiple gospels of Jesus, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are the canonical gospels, but each of them give you a different angle on the same character, on the same historical reality, on the same divine person incarnate. So I don't know. There's just multiple ideas kind of bouncing in my head here, but yeah. So there are canonical texts within the Batman community, and there's also a canonical way of telling Batman's story. So basically, like the idea is that, okay, look, you have Thomas Wayne, who is Bruce Wayne's father, and he's a doctor and a wealthy philanthropist. For I think almost every iteration of Thomas Wayne I've seen, he's always been a doctor. And this is supposed to be like this image of a healer, of someone who is there to make the world better, right? And hence, his philanthropy and Bruce's medical knowledge later when he needs to like bandage his own wounds or do chemistry, so on and so forth. And then on the night that Bruce Wayne's parents are killed, they're leaving the cinema after a showing of The Mark of Zorro. And then the parents are killed by one mugger, Joe Chill. Whereas in Tim Burton's Batman universe, he has two shooters, one of them being, a Jack Napier, who later is revealed to be the Joker. In the canon of the Batman story, Thomas is shot first, and then Martha Wayne is shot. And when she's shot, for some reason, her pearl necklace shatters, either because the gunman, because of the bullet, the impact of the bullet, because Joe Chill grabs her pearls, but for some reason her pearl necklace shatters. And for Bruce Wayne, that pearl necklace remains a very key part of his memory of his mother. And then after the incident is done, Officer Gordon, when he's just an officer, he's not yet lieutenant or commissioner, he comforts a young traumatized Bruce Wayne. Bruce eventually begins his training to become the Batman, which spans several years. Typically, he goes to like Asia, some parts to like learn Kung Fu and all these different forms of martial arts. He even, I think, in some iterations goes to Europe to learn how to be like the best detective that he can be, with a Sherlock Holmes-esque character being his teacher. And then he returns to Gotham, but he returns to Gotham representing vengeance at first. So basically, he returns as a punishment upon criminals. He wants to dish out his anger. What they did to him, he wants to do to them. And he comes back just very vicious and bitter. But then over time, he becomes a symbol of hope and justice. And this is interesting, actually, because this gets into why he has the no gun rule and the no killing rule. So when it comes to the no gun rule, I mean, there were some exceptions. So first off, in the original kind of detective comics telling of Batman, he used a gun. He also like killed people. He also like hung a giant from his bat wing. So I mean, there was kind of like, you know, a moment of kind of learning how to deal with the character, where even the original creators realized, okay, wait, this doesn't really fit with the Batman character. And so eventually you get the no gun rule and you get the no killing rule. But it didn't start that way, which is interesting. But they just started realizing this doesn't really fit with the character and who he is. But the key thing about Batman, the reason why he has the no gun rule and the no kill rule, is that aside from the fact that his parents were killed by a gun, Joe Chill's revolver, guns are killing machines and symbols of no second chances, right? Guns are probably, a very common and reliable way, to end a life. So for Bruce, the fact that one, a gun was used to kill his parents, and two, that this essentially represents that there is no hope, no second chance. It causes him to be hesitant towards guns. The other thing is that Batman doesn't kill his enemies because he wants to give them a second chance. He refuses to give up on them. And this is a key part of the Batman character, because eventually Batman goes from a place of vengeance and bitterness and resentment into realizing that, hey, if I don't change the course of my actions, I'm going to become no better, no different than the villains that I'm pursuing, than the criminals I'm fighting. And so essentially Batman goes from this place of inner darkness and seeing how bad he actually got and pulling himself out to being instead a symbol of hope and justice. It gives him hope, actually, that his criminals can change. If I can even change, if I went to the abyss of my trauma, of my anger, of my resentment and vengeance, and came out instead seeking hope and justice, seeking to redeem myself, then surely there's hope for other people. That's Batman's essential governing principle. That's why he doesn't use guns. That's why he doesn't kill. Now, there are some exceptions where Batman will use a gun, but he always regrets it and is disgusted with himself afterwards. Sometimes he'll use a gun to, I think if he needs to take down a non-living inorganic target, he'll do that. We don't count the Snyderverse Batman because I feel like Zack Snyder in the live action DC movies, aside from Matt Reeves, we're not talking about Matt Reeves Batman, which is in a different universe, but in the Snyderverse, Zack Snyder, I just think he did not understand the character, so I don't even consider that canon personally. It's a bad version, a bad translation and interpretation of Frank Miller's Batman. But that's he'll use a gun sometimes for strategic purposes. In The Dark Knight Returns, he uses a harpoon gun, I think, or a rifle with a harpoon attached to cross a chasm between two buildings. But that's about it. He usually doesn't use guns in the typical way, except in Batman Beyond, when he's desperate and needs to defend himself, he'll pull out a gun after he beats up a criminal. Okay, so basically in the future, Batman gets old. He's trying to save this girl who's been kidnapped, and she's being held for ransom. But he's getting old, his heart's failing, or it's not as strong as it used to be. And so he ends up getting hit a few times. He can't really do his job well defending this girl, saving her. So one of the criminals, that he beat up, they had dropped their gun. So he picks up the gun to scare the other criminal away, but then he throws it. He doesn't use it. So only under like really desperate situations does Batman use a weapon, but he usually doesn't shoot it, or he never aims it at a person intentionally wanting to kill them. But yeah, the no kill rule, that's a big staple of the character. And I just have on the left side, I think it's still an open question, I think, among the fandom, like the exact nature of Bruce Wayne's training. Like, he knows multiple forms of martial arts. But did this training take place over 7 years? I think that's the typical canonical answer. Was it a decade? How long was it? Where all in Asia did he go? Those are kind of specifics that are open. But Tom King, in his Batman Annual #4, had I liked his telling of the story, even though I don't take much of Tom King's Batman to be canonical, where Bruce Wayne, basically on the night of his high school prom, he has a high school sweetheart named Adrienne Williams. And before he leaves to begin his 7-year journey to become the Batman, He has one dance with her and says goodbye. And it's a very sweet, very emotional moment in the comic. And it helps you see that Batman felt like he was plagued with a mission to somehow avenge his parents, to somehow protect this city that the Waynes had built alongside, I believe, the Arkhams, and I think it was the Waynes and the Arkhams who were the main two families of Gotham's history. Anyway, um, yeah. So I think it's a beautiful kind of meditation on what potentially it might have been like in Batman's, stages as a young man to become the Batman. Leaving this high school sweetheart behind, sacrificing this relationship that he could have had so that he could pursue this mission, this crusade of justice. Okay, now Batman's religion. This is a fun topic. So, what religion's Batman? Uh, so we do have some confirmation that Batman's Catholic. All right. So just a quote from this is from the Free Library. I don't know how reliable the source is, but I've seen it multiply attested, so I don't think it's unreliable. Chuck Dixon, who writes Batman cartoon strips for DC Comics, said the brooding superhero's massive guilt complex meant he had to be a Catholic. People talk about Catholic guilt. In a debate on Christianity in comics, Dixon said he had discussed Batman's religion with cartoonist Graham Nolan. Dixon said, Graham and I had an ongoing argument about whether Bruce Wayne was raised a Catholic or a Protestant. I recently conceded to Graham that he must be a Catholic. No Protestant ever suffered guilt the way Bruce does. They based their theory on Batman's enormous guilt and equated that to the so-called Catholic guilt complex arising out of a feeling of repentance for sin and helplessness in solving the world's problems. Yesterday, Monsignor Tom Connolly said, Batman is well known for overcoming evil with good, and that is just what being Catholic is all about. I just hope the angels continue to guide him in everything he does. Batman as a Catholic is not something the Catholic Church in Scotland has a problem with in any way. So I just thought that was a fun little detail to include there. Now, yes, with Batman's religion, there are some iterations that are Catholic. Fans seem to think that Frank Miller also portrayed Batman as Catholic, and I've seen multiple sources say that. Batman sometimes uses sacramental language, like the rain being a baptism for him. I think that in Matt Reeves' Batman, so the latest movie that came out with Robert Pattinson, I think it gestures towards Batman being Catholic, in particular, the continual use of the Ave Maria in that movie. And then at the beginning of the film, when the Riddler is looking outside, you see two Catholic nuns walking down the street. So I think it's heavily implied that like the Batman of this universe is Catholic. There's so many Catholic themes within that film. And on top of that, Robert Pattinson is himself Catholic. And there's been a tendency, at least from what I can tell, among the DC universe to respect if the actor is a certain religion to kind of have their character reflect that. So, for example, Henry Cavill, Zack Snyder's Superman, Henry Cavill, the actor, is also Catholic. And in Man of Steel, he goes to a Catholic priest to talk about, his existential questions. And so I think, with Robert Pattinson being Catholic, with the film having the Ave Maria, Riddler at the beginning looking out and seeing two nuns walking down the street. Also, the fact that, like, yeah, I mean, Bruce has this guilt complex in that movie. I think there's pretty good evidence that the Batman, let's say, what do they call it? Battinson? Robert Pattinson's Batman, I think he's Catholic. Now, Tom King is more explicit that Bruce Wayne once believed in God, but no longer does. And there are other iterations of the character that have him being either atheist or agnostic. If I were trying to harmonize this as a Batman theologian, so to speak, I would just say that Batman's faith seems to be complicated. He probably was raised Catholic. I think the Waynes are pretty firmly established as a Catholic family. Also, the Gothic architecture of Gotham seems to fit really well with like a kind of either high church Anglican, high church Episcopalian, high church Lutheran, or a Catholic setting. Although from what I can tell, I don't think any of those other Protestant high church options have been explored for Batman. I think it's always been either Catholicism or he's agnostic / it's probably because I hit the mic somewhere and that's what happened. So I don't know how much did you miss there? How much was lost? Let's see. Okay, and it was only 3 minutes, so it's still actually this is still actually fixing. So where did I leave off? Does anyone remember? Let's see. Oh, okay. Let me fix this quick if I can. Okay, can you hear me again? I think you should be able to hear me now, right? Yeah, I think my microphone is just very sensitive. All right. So where did I leave off? Does anyone remember? Was it on Did you hear me talk about like Batman's religious beliefs? Let me see here. Yeah, well, if necessary, I can just give a quick summary. So yeah, as I said before, like it's kind of complicated what Batman's religious beliefs are. Um, but just going into like how this applies to like canon debates, some Protestants will say that um, that the formation of the canon was just a bottom up approach, and it was the laity who, through their sensus fidelium, right, decided what the canon is. Whereas Catholics might insist that it was a top down approach where the Catholic Church gave its rubber stamp, and that's what made the canon. But in reality, it is, at least for Catholics, we can take a more nuanced position that it was both a top down and a bottom up phenomenon, right? And yeah, I mean, yeah, okay, I see. So it was, yeah. Anyway, as I was saying with Batman and the high church option, that has never been explored in comics, from what I can tell. There's not ever been an iteration where it implies that he was high church Lutheran, high church Anglican, Episcopalian. It's either been he's Catholic or he's agnostic slash atheist. All right, moving on. Yeah, and then with the canon debate, there's one extreme where Catholics say it has to only be top down, or the history of it was only top down. So they'll cite, Pope Damasus and others. Whereas some Protestants will insist it was just a bottom up phenomenon where it was the laity who decided the canon, the laity. And what I'm trying to say is that no, as Catholics, we can take actually a more nuanced approach where it was both the church and the laity who worked together in forming the canon. And in particular, when we look at like the Batman canon, for example, as I said, DC Comics has to certify the content. So none of the like previous Batman graphic novels that I mentioned, none of them bypassed DC Comics. They had to go through DC Comics to be officially recognized. Or else, if I just wrote a Batman comic at home, it's fan fiction. It doesn't count, and it couldn't potentially count for canonicity. Moreover, I mean, they have a lot of power at DC Comics by executive decision to make significant changes to the character, although they would have to deal with like resistance from fans. They can end stories. For example, they ended the Frank Miller's All-Star Batman, which probably was a good thing because that was not a great line of comics. Or they can place things elsewhere in the multiverse and have maybe they might, like, for example, the DC executives might say, "Oh, we like this story more than how that story ended, so we're going to have this story supersede that one." Right? They can construct the timeline that way if they wanted to. Um, and then at the same time, though, there is this bottom up component where like DC Comics has to respond to the fans and see what resonates with them. And the fans have a lot to say when it comes to which comics are canonical. But it's still DC who needs to make the comics and perpetuate the canon. So even if a fan, or let's say the fans really like a certain storyline of Batman, if DC Comics doesn't continue that comic line, it's just not going to continue, right? So it's both the laity and the institution working together. And I'd even add too that um, I'd even add too uh, that DC Comics is like the authority that unites all Batman fans, right? We have to deal with what DC Comics says. They're the ones who make the graphic novels. They're the ones who approve and certify the Batman media. You can't just like publish your own Batman movie, on your own, unless it's fan fiction or like a fan film, or try and declare it that it's canonical. We are united by the same institutional authority. Hence, we can have a canon. Hence, we can know which texts could count for canonicity and which don't count for canonicity. Moreover, in the early church, right, you had bishops and lay people alike, I think, forming the canon through divine guidance. Because on the one hand, you'll have a bishop sometimes crack down and say, hey, the Gospel of Peter or the Apocalypse of Peter is not, an official gospel. It's not recognized as canonical. I think this was a Saint Epiphanius, if I'm not mistaken, who had to deal with that. Don't quote me on that, but I there was a story of a bishop in the early church who had to deal with the text being passed around as canonical when it wasn't. And then at the same time, though, when later books were being decided as canonical and the authorship of Hebrews came under dispute, people, I think is it Origen who said this, that only God knows who wrote the book of Hebrews. But also people loved the book of Hebrews so much that the church couldn't just like throw it out of the canon, right? So there was a sense in which you have this bottom up and top down approach working together. But the thing that's really important is that you have that top down component. I think the bottom up component really does matter because this is a text that is received by a community. As I said before, it's official. It's an official list of books for a religious community. It exists for the community, the canon. And so there needs to be the involvement of both, right, in the formation of it. Now, because you have the church being able to certify as this universal authority, like DC Comics is for Batman fans, it's this safeguard that allows us, right, that the church must declare the canon lest we just have like fan fiction canons. So for example, like the canon that I just listed out for all of you, I mean, that's kind of my construction, and even with some parts I wasn't quite sure. There's some books that are some books that I'm more confident than others are in the Batman canon. And I mean, right now, if you think about like the Batman fans in our liturgy, so to speak, I mean, I'm using religious parallels here intentionally. In our liturgy, those are the books that are recognized as canonical, and we're doing this in cooperation with DC Comics. But let's say that one day, like DC Comics had to declare these are like the definitive Batman books, or we're resetting the entire Batman universe, right? Then that would be the prerogative of DC Comics to do that. It kind of reminds me of how with like the Disney Star Wars films, the new trilogy, a lot of like the stories that fans enjoyed, like Star Wars The Force Awakens or other stories of like Luke after the rebellion, what did he do? Those stories were eventually casted into, I think they called it not Elseworlds, maybe it was Elseworlds, but Disney with their new trilogy officially declared those other novels and stories not canonical, and then they produced their own canon. I mean, that's a manifestation of actually the top-down approach working in action, and the fans having to just kind of accept, okay, we got to deal with the fact now that the new trilogy, whether we like it or not, is part of the canon. Anyway, I just thought that would be an interesting point to mention, that it's not either top-down or bottom-up. It's both, but the top-down gives it its stability, its official character, and it serves as a universal authority. The other thing too, and I'm going to try to go through this quickly, during a kind of, I guess, a convocation or just a gathering at a Harvard Divinity School where I am now, I talked to one of my Jewish New Testament professors, and she mentioned how when you look at the texts of Second Temple Judaism, not just in the canonical scriptures, but also in the like the pseudepigrapha and the apocrypha, the interesting thing that comes out is that, and this is her theory, and I think it's correct, ancient Jews operated with the idea of a general biblical past where you had characters like Abraham, Moses, Isaac, and Jacob. They are part of like the mythos, not to say that they weren't real, but just part of the I don't know, the founding story, right? These are the founding characters. And you can access their story through the canonical text, but also through tradition. So you could have retellings and additions to the story. And that's how in the Second Temple period, you see texts like Jubilees and others that are retelling stories or putting a spin on them, like the Temple Scroll, of the Qumranites or the Essenes. And it's just interesting because I started getting the sense that in the Second Temple period, you actually see the idea of sola scriptura breaking down. That might be, I mean, that is anachronistic. But basically, like ancient Jews started realizing, okay, we need more than just the Pentateuch. We need more than just the prophets and the Psalms. We need like other ways to create new laws, or to deal with our changing circumstances with, you know, the Hellenization of our people. And so Lawrence Schiffman, I read this in my Jewish law class. He has a paper called a book called the Halacha at Qumran, and he said, quote, all groups of Jews realized that the Torah could not be lived by if taken literally. The rabbis were freed from the yoke of literalism by the oral law concept or the oral tradition concept. Within the context of oral law, the sages enacted laws which had no basis in scripture, but which made the biblical system livable. At Qumran, the exegetical method of Perush, or I think that's Pesher hermeneutics, played the same role. Through this technique, laws could be derived from verses without the use of proof texts. In other words, Perush afforded the Qumran sect the same escape from the literal word that the dual Torah concept gave the rabbinic Jews. My point in citing this is obviously this isn't like a neat parallel to the example before because this deals with legal interpretation, and doesn't deal with like, you know, something like Jubilees, which is retelling a story, or the Temple Scroll, which is kind of changing actually a story quite significantly. But I think it reflects that there was this general attitude among ancient Jews that, hey, we need more to the story, to deal with our current circumstance. And so Jubilees has the idea of, for example, the written Torah, the one that Moses received, and it has a heavenly Torah, that is like fixed and unchanging. And it's supposed to give people confidence that, you know, even that there is this heavenly law, and that even though the law of Moses seems so particular to ancient Israel and its moment, there is a heavenly Torah. There is a heavenly law to abide by. I mean, that's just one interpretation of what the heavenly Torah is doing in Jubilees. Regardless, the point I'm bringing up here is that when you look at, you know, the story of Batman, right? Like there seems to be an essence of the character, but then that character, that essence is captured and expressed in various canonical texts. And there are accepted retellings and additions to the classic Batman story. And if that's the case, at least for us, then we're in a situation, I'd argue, comparable to ancient Jews during the time of Jesus, where you had, you know, the canonical texts, right? Obviously, the Pentateuch, Deuteronomy being cited heavily. But then you had like the Assumption of Moses in the first century. You had the lives of the prophets. You had these other texts that contained the traditions and the ideas of the ancient Jewish people to make sense of their times, to deal with their climate and their circumstances. And so we're actually in a situation very similar. And so it would be kind of ridiculous for us to say right now, like, you know, with Batman, like there's the Batman canon's not closed. It's still going to be creating, still going to be producing as the market changes, as political circumstances change. And at least with the story of the scriptures during the time of Jesus, you had scripture and tradition working together. And then even in the early church, you had the tradition of the apostles governing and guiding the church. And then because now, you know, the apostolic deposit is fixed, right? There's not going to be a new divine revelation, public revelation cease with the last apostle. It's the job of the church now to develop that doctrine and to find within the deposit answers to the questions that are besetting us now. Now, there is this question about like the circularity of theology and the formation of the canon. So, you know, for example, and this is kind of an argument that I've been thinking about but haven't finished yet, where on the one hand, you need true theology to know the canon. On the other hand, a Protestant's going to insist that you need the canon to know true theology. And so it's almost like a chicken and an egg problem. And at least the way I'm thinking that you break the chicken and the egg problem is by having like a third agent in, right? Where you say like, okay, no, actually you bite one of the bullets and then you nuance the maybe you bite the bullet and then you nuance one of the other points. You take one horn and you neutralize the other. But it seems to me that like in the history of the church, you need to first know what true theology is. And in the early church, they knew what true theology was, in part through the scriptures, at least the ones that were accepted by the community and cited most often, especially the Gospel of Matthew. That was a sure text for orthodoxy, a very beloved text. But notice you have to know it through the community, the canon, right? What's canonical, what's not. And so, but the community, knew the true theology, or knew what was canonical because they had the true theology, the apostolic oral tradition handed on to them through the bishops, right? And then the bishops then were able to say, that's canonical. Oh, no, that's not. Gospel of Peter is not in, but Gospel of Matthew's in, right? But it seems as if, right, if you say that we can only know true theology through the canon, then it's really hard to explain how the canon was formed in the first place. When to form that canon, you needed the true theology first, right? But if there's a third source like oral tradition and the guidance of the Holy Spirit over the bishops to help them preserve that deposit, then I think that's a way that you get out of this circularity problem. At least that's one argument I've been thinking about. Okay, now to human nature. So there's a question in the Batman comics on whether or not humans are naturally good or naturally evil. And there's also the question on, can human beings become irredeemable? And obviously, this is a question in theology. Typically speaking, I've seen when I was Protestant, the answer to the first question was yes, humans are naturally evil. And it would be funny because then you ask the question, well, was Jesus fully human then, if to be humans to be evil? And usually there's like some humming and hawing, but I don't know how you get around that. I feel like for me, it's a pretty clear QED that being evil is not essential to human nature. It can be a consequence of the fall, a woundedness, a condition that we carry, like a parasite. But to say that that is what it is to be human, I think that goes too far. And, when I was entering the church, the position that I heard was that actually humans were created good and that we are deep down good, but we have this awful parasite of original sin that is on us. And then, can human beings become irredeemable? That's a heavy subject. And I think that gets into, for some people, I think some of us, especially Catholics and conservative Protestants, have no problem saying, yeah, that's possible. I think for some people who are, especially universalists, that's a very difficult concept for them to swallow. But we'll get into that. So the theme of whether or not humans are naturally good or naturally evil appears so many times in the Batman comics, but it especially appears in The Killing Joke and The Dark Knight, Christopher Nolan's second movie in his trilogy. So obviously, Joker's kind of agenda in The Killing Joke is to show that all it takes is one bad day for anybody to become corrupt. That it can happen to anybody. Everybody has a breaking point, and you just need to hit that breaking point. And so for Joker, he has a very cynical view of human nature, where, and this is now going to the Dark Knight Joker, where in that monologue that he has with the Batman in the GCPD lockup, Joker says, Heath Ledger's Joker says, all these civilized people at the first sign of trouble will eat each other. He's trying to point out that people aren't really as good as they think they are. And it's actually a very kind of satanic character if you think about it. The devil's whole point is to discourage us and to make us hopeless and to think that there's really not much that God can do to save us. And then that's how the devil, gets the souls in his grasp. But right. This is a theme, as I said, explored in the Batman universe. And if you think about it, if Batman's whole agenda, if Batman's whole ethos is that anybody can be redeemed, if even he could be redeemed, then anybody else can be redeemed. Then the Joker stands in stark contrast to that philosophy, which is why their conflict is so intense. And this is also why, the Joker is probably, of all his villains, the one that unsettles him the most, because I think it makes Batman really wonder, have I met someone who's actually irredeemable? So, in the Killing Joke at the end, Batman and Joker have a one-on-one conversation after Joker has done some atrocities, some really horrible things in that story. And I'm just going to read what it says here. This might get hit with a copyright, so be it. Batman says to Joker, "It doesn't have to end like that. I don't know what it was that bent your life out of shape, but who knows? Maybe I've been there too. Maybe I can help. We could work together. I could rehabilitate you. You needn't be out there on the edge anymore. You needn't be alone. We don't have to kill each other. What do you say?" Here, Batman, I think this is the only time I've seen ever recorded in the comics or just in popular media where Batman like extends his hand to the Joker to try and help him, to try and redeem him. Because remember, Batman's philosophy is that anybody can be redeemed. And he's a bit naive, but at the start of the Killing Joke, like Batman says, like, I don't want to kill you, but I feel like the way this is going, one of us is going to kill the other. And then he finally gets to, but then the Joker that he's speaking to at the beginning of the comic isn't the actual Joker. It's an inmate who's been switched out for him. Here, Batman makes his petition, and Joker kind of just says, "No, I'm beyond saving." And so Joker kind of seals his own fate at that moment. But yeah, I mean, the Joker seems to be the closest example of someone who just cannot be redeemed, actually, in the Batman universe. There are some iterations where he is redeemed and he does become a good guy, but those aren't really considered canonical among Batman fans. And just going back to the idea of human nature again, Batman refuses to give up on his villains because, he sees himself in them, really. He sees that they are deeply wounded and responding to their own brokenness. So on the top right in the Batman, the animated series, I forget which season this is, but it has this, character named Baby Doll. And she's basically a grown woman who has this birth defect where she can't grow any further beyond like her childhood self. So she's literally like a young, an older woman, a grown woman in a young girl's body, and she just hates that she can't have a normal life. And then when Batman finally confronts her and she runs out of bullets in her gun, Batman doesn't beat her up. Batman doesn't, talk her down. He just allows her to cry and he holds on to her because he knows that she's reacting out of pain, out of hurt, and that, he also understands what it's like to be, in a way, a grown person stuck in a child's body, or maybe vice versa, a child stuck in a grown man's body, because he couldn't ever get over his trauma, over his pain. Or you could think about it as like when he was a child, he was forced to grow up and become a man before he even knew what to do, you know. But anyway, like Batman could relate with her trauma, and he knew that he didn't have to like do anything further to deal with her. And then even in The Dark Knight Returns, Batman, or Bruce Wayne, it pays for Harvey Dent's, Two-Faith's facial reconstruction so that Harvey can have a normal life again, have a normal face. And it's beautiful because Harvey says, "I knew that my friend Bruce never gave up on me." And that's the heart of Batman's character. He's trying to redeem his villains. And the key thing is that Batman's villains all reflect some aspect of himself. And if he gives up on them, then he would be giving up on himself. So, I mean, just take any like villain in the Batman rogues gallery, and you can see how it's in some way an iteration of him. So, like the Joker, for example, the Joker is somebody who takes a symbol of happiness and joy and laughter, a clown, and turns it into a dark and upsetting, monstrosity. Batman takes this image of a bat, which is terrifying for him. It's his childhood fear. Kind of almost looks a little demonic with the horns, and he turns it into a symbol of hope and justice, right? He and Joker are very similar. Also, he and Joker, they both experienced one bad day that changed them forever and caused them to have an alternate persona that they live by. If you take Mr. Freeze, for example, like Mr. Freeze, he has his wife who is, who he freezes to try and preserve her life while he finds a cure for her disease. And so you see that Mr. Freeze has this sense of loss, this sense of running out of time, this sense of, he was wronged because eventually, I forget who the head of the company was, but they don't allow him to, is it Daggett? No, I don't know. Anyway, he was a scientist with a certain company, and they tried to unplug his wife's machine, because they were like, this is a waste of time, so on and so forth. And then obviously he comes back as Mr. Freeze. And the other thing too is that he and Mr. Freeze, Batman and Mr. Freeze, are both intelligent. They're both brilliant, physically dominating. They both have a suit of armor. I mean, they have a lot in common. Penguin, think about how Bruce Wayne's a businessman, and then Penguin is just the easy flip side of how bad he can really become. Same is true with Black Mask. The Riddler has a super intellect, as does Batman, and they both are interested in Riddler's interested in making mysteries and riddles. Batman's interested in solving them. But they both have super intellects. And then obviously Harvey Dent, Two-Face, he's a symbol. I mean, he reflects actually the fact that Bruce also has two personalities within himself, one being the normal Bruce Wayne, the other being Batman. In the case of Two-Face, there's Harvey, and then there's the Two-Face character. And then also, like, Harvey at one time was a symbol of hope and justice, and then he becomes a symbol of vengeance, particularly against the Batman, because he blames Batman for causing one of Falcone's men. I think it's Falcone or it's Maroni, one of them, to douse acid on his face. Anyway, so there's an explanation there. And I think about Batman, I'm reminded of this passage of scripture. It's Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 to 16. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let's hold firmly to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things just as we are, yet without sin. Therefore, let's approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace for help at the time of our need. If you imagine Batman as essentially emulating Christ in the desert, being tempted, but triumphing over Satan, I think that's the perfect Christological image for understanding the character of Batman. Because Batman doesn't deep down want to punish the criminals. He doesn't, at first he does, but eventually, because he can sympathize with their weaknesses, with their traumas, and with their struggles, he becomes a different kind of hero. He becomes a different kind of, let's say, high priest of justice and hope. And so, this is where you see Batman's mercy, his grace comes out, where his compassion comes out. And especially, I think, necessary watching, if you really want to understand the heart and the character of Batman, looking at the left side of the screen, watch Justice League Season 2, episodes 21 and 22, called Wildcard Part 1, Wildcard Part 2. And then watch Season 2, Episode 26, Epilogue, where Batman Beyond Terry McGinnis goes and confronts Amanda Waller. These three episodes together, I don't want to spoil anything, but if you watch them all together, you're going to see the heart of Batman. Especially, you're not going to see it maybe like in episode 21. You might just think, okay, this is a regular Justice League episode. Episode 22, you kind of see it come out. But episode 26 is Chef's Kiss. That's where you see Batman comforting one of his villains and relating with them. And just the way it's done, it shows you that Batman's greatest superpower is actually his empathy, his mercy, and his gentleness and compassion. All right. And I think there's theological application here when we think about Christ. Like, for example, some of us imagine projecting our own guilt and shame, Jesus as a vengeful and frightening figure. When in reality, Jesus ought to be a symbol of hope and justice for us. He does not aim to punish us, but to enter into our brokenness, even our death and mortality, so that we might know that we are not alone and that we can triumph over our personal demons. Just as Batman is this symbol that dwells in the dark, seems to be this shadowy, scary figure, but he ends up actually being a symbol of hope. Christ takes the cross, which is a symbol of empire, a symbol of oppression, of the power of the world, of death, and he turns it into a symbol of triumph, into a symbol of not even death can ultimately hold me. And I think this inversion, right, that happens with the Batman character and with Christ, it's a really powerful motif. And I think that using what we can learn from the character of Batman has a lot of theological value and implications. Right. And just going into the question then about like whether or not humans are naturally good or naturally evil. I mean, the catechism says that the first man was not only created good, but was also established in friendship with his creator and in harmony with himself and with the creation around him, in a state that would be surpassed only by the glory of the new creation in Christ. So I think that we can say humans after the fall exist in a tragic state. Now, by a tragic state, I don't mean a hopeless state, right? But I do mean a state where we are very fragile, we're very vulnerable to the effects of sin and concupiscence. Um, that if you had to bet it, when people are pushed, when push comes to shove, that they would, you know, that they might choose what's wrong if they can get away with it. Like take the Ring of Gyges, like in Plato's Republic. You know, people could be invisible and get away with anything. Would they be the same people, or would they would they let their inner thoughts get the better of them? Um, because of original sin, an an upper bound is placed in our perfection, right? Original sin does not mean, let's say, that we are guilty as if we had really done Adam's sin, or we're born with a strike already on our record. Original sin just establishes the upper bound that we aren't born with sanctifying grace. And so we can only go as far as a wounded nature can go. But once grace enters the picture through baptism, Augustine calls it the sacrament of justification, or it's Trent citing Augustine, or it's just Trent. The possibility for goodness is endless. The upper bound, the upper ceiling is gone, because then theosis is possible. The righteousness of God is within reach. And we have to participate, obviously, and work with the sacraments to grow in holiness. But at the same time, though, we still have concupiscence that doesn't go away. But we are created good. And some people say that, no, humans are just reprobate and disgusting and horrible. And that's why Christ died on the cross. But the thing is, you don't die on a cross for somebody. You don't sacrifice your life for somebody if you don't think that they have deep down value and worth and are precious. Yes, Christ does, on the one hand, reconcile us to God. And so, yes, the divine justice of God is infinitely valuable and must be satisfied. Now, how exactly I cash out the atonement, that's a separate episode. But at the same time, though, the fact that Christ died for us while we were still sinners shows that there's something in us that Christ finds valuable and precious. And so when some Protestant pastors I heard growing up made fun of like self-esteem or talking about self-worth, I think that's really dangerous, and I don't even think it's Christian. I think that deep down, like as Paul talks about, we are temples of the Holy Spirit. We are his beloved, right? He desires to gather us like a mother hen. You don't die for somebody if you don't think that they are infinitely precious, that you think that they are worth so much more than they can even imagine. And so I like to say like two things about the Christian life. One is that the goal of the Christian life is to find out what Christ saw in you on the cross. Let me say that again. The goal of the Christian life is to find out, what did Christ see in me when he was on the cross? The second thing about the Christian life is to remember that we aren't waiting for a victory. Rather, the Christian life is, how do you live in light of already having won through Christ? And that if you really take that second one to heart, it changes the way you view things. It's not, oh, I have to fight and strive to win. It's, How do I live my life in light of Christ having already won it for me, of things already being settled? I mean, that's a very powerful thing. And obviously this doesn't mean that we don't have to participate and remain faithful to him, obviously not. But that if we are in him and we remain faithful to him as he has remained faithful to us, then we have already won. And so what are we worried about? What are we stressing about? What are we clamoring about if the point of the Christian life is to know that we have already won, that we live in light of having already won? Now, I mean, I just want to say too that, like, on the point about like the tragic state of human nature, how it's supposed to move us towards compassion, mercy, and gentleness with each other, because we know that we're fragile, that we're vulnerable. You know, Saint John in his epistle, I think it's the first one, talks about don't cause your brother to stumble, right? Don't be a scandal to him, basically. Um, I think about like Matthew chapter 7. I think this is verse 12. Um, yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. Matthew chapter 7 is a very actually telling passage. So, or pericope. You know, Jesus says, "Do not judge, so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you." In this way, like, Jesus kind of acknowledges to his audience, like, "Hey, you all, if you're going to judge other people, remember that you're also vulnerable. You also kind of exist in this tragic state. And so be careful when you judge others. Your disposition should not be to condemn, but to be patient, to be merciful, just as your Father in heaven is merciful." So I think here, this is kind of implicit evidence of a tragic view of human nature within the Bible. Obviously, it doesn't perpetually remain tragic because grace enters the picture. But then again, I think that the whole point of Christian theology is to kind of balance both tragedy and also the prospect of infinite glory and perfection. And somehow, you know, you have to juggle these two together. But you can't give up one in the place of the other. Because then if you give up one in the place of the other, you get a naive view of human nature, or you get one that downplays the wages and depth of sin. On the other hand, if you only have the tragic view, then you just have despair, right? Um, yeah, you just have despair. Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 to 14, Jesus says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who enter through it." So notice this is a tragic view of human nature. "For the gate is narrow and the way is constricted that leads to life, and there are few who find it." Once again, Jesus seems to express a kind of tragic view that most people are going to choose the easy way that leads to destruction rather than the tough way that leads to life. Similarly, Matthew 7:22, "Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?'" Notice he says many, right? It seems as if Jesus on the one hand has a tragic view of human nature, but it moves him to express the mercy and the compassion of God, and the mercy and compassion that we have towards one another, knowing our vulnerability and our imperfections. At the same time, though, paradoxically, especially Matthew's gospel, you are called to perfection. And what makes this perfection possible? Grace. As the Council of Trent says, that it is possible for someone having received grace, you know, after baptism, to really truly live a perfect life, to not even ever commit a mortal sin. You know, it's possible for someone to live a perfect life if they really did cooperate with grace. And it is really, truly possible for us to cooperate with grace and live that life out. It's not this hopeless possibility. I know that there are some Protestants who still hold that, yeah, even after you've been justified and even infused with Christ's righteousness, it's still not possible. Everyone's still going to fall. But that's not how Catholics view it. It's really possible that somebody after receiving grace could live a perfect life. But the problem is that, you know, grace is resistible. I should say it's a problem. It's just the reality that grace is resistible. We don't lose our free will and our ability to choose and will things. Um, Not saying that being perfect would, but I am saying that that aspect of our autonomy is retained with the consequence in this world that a lot of people still choose to do wrong even after receiving grace. Um, But should we say that God is the author of sin? No, God forbid. Oh, and I just want to mention Eliakim really quick is the last part of this Batman presentation. So in 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 through 6, it mentions the royal administration of Solomon. And some people have pointed out that, well, look, the royal steward, the master of the palace, the master of the house, however you want to describe the Hebrew, is, I think, fourth on this list. Let's see. Well, he's after a bunch of people. I don't even think he's fourth, actually. Let's see. You have Azariah, then you have the sons of Shisha, Jehoshaphat, okay, the secretary. And then you have Benaiah. Okay, yeah. So, I mean, this guy, Ahishar, who's one of the first recorded royal stewards, prime ministers of ancient Israel, well, really just royal steward at this point, one over the house. He's like way down the list, right? You're telling me that this is supposed to be the typological a type of Peter, that this is supposed to be the impressive steward. But then when you get to 2 Kings 18:18, it says, then they called to the king, and Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, who was in charge of the household, Shebna the scribe, and Joah, the son of Asaph, the secretary, went out to them. Eliakim is constantly placed first in the list of the leaders, right? Whenever he's listed alongside other royal officials, if I'm not mistaken, he's always listed first. And it's supposed to show you, to some extent, his preeminent position. Also, Isaiah 22 gives you some details of his preeminence compared to the other royal servants. But the point is that you start off with the master of the palace, this office in ancient Israel, being a minor position, to all of a sudden being one of the highest positions under the king. And some people have said, okay, Suan, this is supposed to disprove your Eliakim argument for the papacy, the textual allusion between Matthew 16:19 and Isaiah 22:22, because, this office really wasn't actually that important. Or like it didn't exist under King David's monarchy, which is true because King David, based on archaeology and just what we know about David's rise to power, there weren't a lot of officials to begin with. He didn't inherit that much property, so to speak. It's really under King Solomon or near the end of David's life and the reign of King Solomon, that a lot more prosperity comes in and a lot more of the riches come in. I think some archaeologists believe that, like the city under Israel under King David might have been more like a tent city. So he couldn't really have that many royal officials. But then once you have the temple built, okay, then you need to, have a larger shrine, have greater protection around Jerusalem, so on and so forth. Anyway, my point is that I've used this example before actually on my other lectures on Eliakim, where you can compare the chief steward to Alfred, because Alfred doesn't seem like a significant character, right? He's just the butler of Bruce Wayne. But then Bruce Wayne trusts him like a father figure, because in a lot of ways, Alfred is his father figure. But also just by like being a butler, you think, okay, he doesn't have that much power. But then in reality, because he is Bruce Wayne's right-hand man, he's trusted with an incredible degree of authority and responsibility in Batman's mission. Similarly, the chief steward, who was placed over the king's royal estate and palace and the temple, he was made to watch over these things. The chief steward gains power in ancient Israel because that office, like Alfred being butler, proves to be an incredibly important office for the king. He manages the king's property. And when he shows himself to be able to reliably manage the palace and the king's royal estates, he's able to eventually, from what I think, watch over the temple. I know by the time of Shebna, he's responsible for the temple tax, if I'm not mistaken, or the treasury. He has power over the treasury. But by the time of Eliakim, I mean, the Septuagint just views Eliakim as a high priest, basically. And so does I'm guessing it's the Targums or the Targumim. Anyway, I just wanted to bring this up as kind of like showing how you have this right-hand trusted official who he might just seem like a butler. Some people like to say, oh, he's not a prime minister. Eliakim's not a prime minister. He's just over the palace. He's just a master of the house. But when you pay attention to what that office meant for the king and how the king eventually elevates that office into being not like number 6 on the list under King Solomon to number 1 under King Hezekiah. And you think about like Alfred's relationship to Bruce Wayne, I think you see, why that office becomes so important. Right. And well, that is my presentation on the theology of Batman. I looked at Batman's connection to like thinking about the canon of scripture, to human nature, and to the Eliakim argument. Let me see here if I can just look at some comments that people have left here. Okay, yeah, and please ask me any questions that you have about a Batman or anything like that. Okay, so John asked, "Have you been watching The Penguin?" My favorite scene is when he says it's penguin time and then eats a whole fish. Yeah, it's Morbin time, right? Yeah, I need to eventually see The Penguin, but I've been trying to save money and haven't gotten HBO yet. So maybe one of these days I'll get HBO and catch up on The Penguin. I've been paying attention to like the memes and just what I can hear through the grapevine. Yeah, there were things about Tom King's. Oh, Storyteller says Tom King's run has been great. There are certainly things that I like about Tom King's Batman, but I know that some people didn't like his run of the character. But there were things that I definitely enjoyed. I think that like his view of the relationship between Batman and Catwoman is going to become canonical, like their marriage, basically. Spoiler alert. Although I don't think it lasts long, from what I remember. And what else was there? Oh, and then like I mentioned before with like Bruce Wayne and his high school sweetheart, I thought that was like a really nice touch to his run of the character. Yeah, and then Storyteller says, I would say that Court of Owls is canon by default by being part of the main Batman comic series. That's right, yeah, because it's part of the New 52. My only reservation, and maybe you can correct me on this, Storyteller, is that the New 52 is supposed to be a reboot. Oh, well, yeah, it's supposed to be the reboot and the new canon for the character, right? They redid Superman story or to some extent and other character stories. Yeah, because I think Alan Moore was the one who wrote Superman, Man of Tomorrow, which was like the end of the OG Superman. Anyway, there's a question on to what extent do you want to consider the new, you don't want to consider the New 52 the whole canon, right? It's still there because it's still part of this larger canon. Like, I don't want to say that the New 52 undid Batman Year One. Maybe it did. But certainly as a fan, I don't want to pretend like the New 52 undid that. And also there's this question on, I don't actually need to look into this more. Does Scott Snyder place that Batman? To what extent does he include that Batman or take Frank Miller's Batman and include it into his universe? I mean, I don't know, but I just don't want to say that Scott Snyder's Batman is the whole canon now, right? But I would say it is part of the canonical Batman at this point. I'm certainly convinced. What's the was it Molly Gauze Blues says, what's the equivalent of Batman Deuterocanon? Okay, this is a good question. I think that like Batman Arkham Asylum, A Madhouse on Mad Earth would count in the Deuterocanon. Probably Batman Ego would count in the Deuterocanon. The reason why is just that these are books that are respected in the Batman community, known by maybe a niche few who are really into the character. At the same time, though, there's not been enough like reception within other comics or other media to confirm that they are definitely, well, Batman Arkham Asylum arguably has a better canonical standing than Batman Ego, because Batman Ego is so short. But I mean, you do have like these stories in the backbone of the you do have like a secondary canon of books that like deep Batman fans know and but have not been confirmed or are not really on the same level as the canonical books, right? At least that's a Protestant understanding of a Deuterocanon. I know one Catholic biblical scholar who I'll leave unnamed who doesn't like to call the 7 books the Deuterocanon because it implies a secondary canon, which I mean for us, right? The 7 books are just part of the Old Testament, right? It's not like they're a secondary canon. No, I mean they're just 7 canonical books. So yeah, but in the Batman community, there are certainly things like a deuterocanonical book, like deuterocanonical books. All right, let's see here. Oh yes, so Mr. C, a layman, says there's the Waynes, the Arkhams, the Elliots, and the Cobblepot family, and that's right because what's his name? Oh, why am I blanking on his first name? The Penguin's first name, Oswald Cobblepot. He blames the Waynes for bringing down his family. So yeah, that is true. There are 4 major families: the Waynes, the Arkhams, the Elliots, and the Cobblepots. Oh yeah. So same person as before. Batman is Anglican and Morrison's Gothic run. That's good to know. I didn't know that. Storyteller also says that he doesn't take the writer's statements, Chuck Dixon's comments, as like confirming, that Batman is authoritatively, definitely Catholic, but his portrayal is consistent with being Catholic. That's true. Yeah, but a lot of people like lean towards him being a type of atheist or agnostic anyway. Okay. And then Olive Mule said, Superman is Jewish. Look it up. The actor for Superman in James Gunn's DC universe is Jewish. I think, yeah. Superman was created by Jewish comic book artists, if I'm not mistaken. And I think in the comics, though, he's at least the OG Superman is Methodist or some type of Christian, Protestant Christian growing up in Kansas. So I think that's all I can confirm there with Batman, or excuse me, with Superman. Okay. And then let's see, what did I think of More Sultra asked, what did you think of the Sijuwati Branson versus Wagner Astro debate? I haven't had time to watch it yet, but I'm interested to watch it. Storyteller asked, do you think that Batman canon allows for a degree of vagueness that results from incorporating some mutually inconsistent versions of Batman's origin? For example, if yes, do you think there might be a further parallel with how many potential inconsistencies in the Second Temple Judaism canon were treated? Okay, so first, let's see here. A degree of vagueness. Yeah, I mean, there is a degree of openness with some aspects, I think, of Batman's origin story, right? Like I said, for example, who did he train under? Where in Asia did he go for his training? How long was it? That sort of thing. There's some vagueness because of the mutual inconsistencies. So, right. And I mean, and the fact that we have to kind of do this harmonization or just figuring things out because we have these inconsistent stories. That's just a given, right? So the Batman canon can allow for that. And then eventually, let's see, like if, I don't know, let's say Frank Miller publishes Batman Year Zero, hypothetically, right? And it's like really loved by fans as this is how it happened. This is how Batman became Batman. Then that could become more clarified. So yeah, there's vagueness allowed. Do you think there might be a further parallel with how potential inconsistencies in the Second Temple Judaism canon were treated? Yeah, I think so, because ancient Jews were aware of like certain questions in the biblical canon. Like, well, like for example, I'm trying to think about one text that is dealt with. Well, as I said with Jubilees, right? There's this question on, was the Torah meant to be forever? Can we still be Jewish and not observe the law? And then if you have a heavenly tablet, a heavenly Torah, then it's like, okay, well, okay, yeah, then that's permanent, that's fixed, right? You also have the retelling of the story of the founding of the temple with the temple scroll to basically say that it was illegitimate from the beginning, and so that you needed a sect always to come along. And even the sect too, in its writings, the Qumran sect, the Essenes, when they go through biblical history, they they don't portray what is it? I think they portray Abraham as the first righteous man, not Adam, and they emphasize that. Oh, I'm trying to remember actually now. I want to be careful not to make comments off the cuff, but yeah, they use the characters. They use their own biblical theology to make the characters of the Bible fit into their agenda and to support their conclusions. And so there are theological questions that come up that they use their extra traditions to deal with. And I'm trying to think about, like, one classic example too is, what is it? Do you this is in the Pentateuch, do you burn or do you boil, right? Um the like a sacrifice. And then later on, I think later, what is this in King Josiah's time, it says something like in Deuteronomy, it says you boil it in fire or something like that. Like, you see later on people having to make sense of these texts, put things together, harmonize them, compile multiple traditions together, and make it look like it was a single written source. I mean, things like that. I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. Sorry, but that was a bit of a rambly response there. I also haven't really eaten much today, so I need to eventually get going. But yeah, when dealing with problems with the canon or questions, people would write news stories. And the assumption in the ancient world was that Solomon, for example, wrote more books than just Proverbs and Kohelet or Ecclesiastes. It was assumed that he wrote other books like, Wisdom, although that's kind of disputed. But people were open to there being more revelations, more books than just the canonical few that they knew, because the assumption was that there was more to be known. It's a larger mystery than just the text. And, Enoch, was very popular as being a book that survived the flood. Anyway, Matthew Schmidt says, man, I love you. Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you, Matthew. Love you too. Tony L says, growing in my appreciation of Batman. Yeah, I mean, as a kid, some people think that Batman is just kind of like a funny, action figure, superhero character. But then when you really get into the lore of Batman, it gets very deep, very fast, and very existential, very philosophical. So let's see here. Is Batman Christian themed? You could make it Christian themed, to be honest. Although I don't know if anybody's intentionally done that except Frank Miller, with Batman describing the rain as like a baptism. Yeah, and then, okay, this is good to know. Storyteller said the New 52 got incorporated into the wider multiverse with DC Rebirth. So basically, they gave up on restricting the canon with New 52. That's good. Yeah. So, yeah. So then that means that it's not just the New 52 that's canon. It's canonical, but part of a larger canon, which includes the other stories that we know and love. All right. Well, I hope that you enjoyed this episode today on the Theology of Batman. I do apologize for the sound issues. I think it lasted 3 minutes, so hopefully it wasn't too long. And for any of my Catholic listeners who are, obviously we won't be celebrating Reformation Day, you can also celebrate my mother's birthday. I hit my mic again. Hopefully the audio didn't go out. Okay, yeah. My mother's birthday is today. And so if you want to celebrate that instead of Reformation Day, please do. And yeah, and then tomorrow, remember, it's a holy day of obligation. So I'll see you at Mass tomorrow.